Good evening, everybody, and welcome to DIA and the Readings in Contemporary Poetry series. My name is Megan Whitco. I'm a curatorial associate here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. It's so nice to have a great crowd here. This is actually our final reading of 2014, but we'll be resuming again in February, and we hope to see some people returning then, and a lot of the information about that will go up on our website in early 2015 as well. So DIA's Readings in Contemporary Poetry series was reinstated in 2011 in a partnership with the series curator, Vincent Katz. And the monthly readings highlight commonalities amongst different poets and bring their work into a larger conversation. So tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome our two poets for the evening, Paul Auster and Siri Hustvedt. Thank you both for generously agreeing to be a part of the series tonight. I also want to give a thank you to the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. It's their support helps make these evenings possible. And we also want to give a thank you to Brooklyn Brewery for the complimentary cold beverages for everybody tonight, and to all of the DIA staff who help make these evenings possible for everyone. So thank you. So following our first reader, we're going to have a brief 10-minute intermission period, and then following that, Vincent will come back up and introduce the second poet. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Vincent up to introduce our first poet. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you all for coming. Yes, it's definitely a great way to conclude our year with this tonight's reading. I'd just like to mention some of the readers we have coming up in the spring. There's going to be some excellent readings then, too. So we've got Basil King and Pam Dick, Clark Coolidge and Eddie Berrigan, Peter Gizzi and Frank Andre Jam, presented by Cole Swenson, and Joanne Kiger reading with Stephen Motika, and maybe a little surprise reading thrown in as well we're working on. It is exciting to have these two artists reading together in our last reading of the season and the year. It is not uncommon for writers in various genres to publish poetry in their youth and then to stop. There is a truism that such an experience of poetry's focus on rhythms, sound, and condensation can provide a prose writer with an expertise in handling language that he or she might lack absent that experience. Like all truisms, there is something true in this idea. However, in the cases of Paul Auster and Siri Hustvedt, both of whom published poetry early in their careers, something stranger and deeper is at work. Auster has been quoted as saying, "Anyone who becomes a poet is always in some relationship to his world an exile." And elsewhere, anyone who is making art of any kind is out of the world. You can't be in it in order to do it. Interestingly, he sees poetry as what he calls a univocal expression, whereas prose for him is ambiguous, even self-contradictory. I would argue that this Whitmanic quality is central to poetry's aversion to narrative, and that Auster and Hustvedt both retain qualities of thinking in their work that derive from the appreciation and understanding of and thinking in poetry. It is our great pleasure to have them reading together tonight. Paul Auster will read first. Paul Auster is the author of Invisible, The Book of Illusions, In the Country of Last Things, and the New York Trilogy, among other works. His nonfiction books include The Invention of Solitude, The Art of Hunger, and Hand to Mouth. He has in recent years published the autobiographical works Report from the Interior and Winter Journal, and the novel Sunset Park. He edited the Random House book of 20th century French poetry and has translated the work of Paul Eluard, André Breton, Tristan Zara, Philippe Soupal, and René Char, among others. Auster published several volumes of poetry in the 1970s. This work can be found in his collected poems, published by the Overlook Press, in 2004. There is, behind the clarity of Paul Auster's prose, the limpidity of his poet's voice. It is thought that the study of poetry aids prose writers in such areas as word choice, rhythm, assonance, etc. While this may be true, it obscures the fact that there are very few fiction writers who are also poets. Paul Auster is one of these few. I don't mean in terms of published output, but rather that the essence of poetry has always been at the basis of Auster's prose. Auster will be reading from his winter journal tonight, a section about watching a dance performance. I'm impressed in reading this passage by two things. One is his observation about music's role in providing narrative coherence and emotional tone, with its absence leading to abstraction. And the second is his phrase, a physical joy that was also of the mind. Both observations seem entirely germane to the art of poetry. He was writing poetry at that time and went on to write what he calls a text of no definable genre. As much philosophical meditation as poem and prose, the work, entitled White Spaces, 1979, opens up areas for contemplation in a way that few other contemporary works do. A man sets out on a journey, he writes, to a place he has never been before. Another man comes back. It was a transitional moment for Auster, and he came through it transformed. Tonight, he takes us back to that moment to look at process and creation in his inimitable way. Please join me in welcoming Paul Auster to DIA.
Well, thank you for those kind words. They're much appreciated. So, as Vincent said, I'm going to read from something written fairly recently, Winter Journal, in order to go back to something written a long time ago. But these are the circumstances under which this early piece that I'll read second was written. So this is late in the book. I'm on page 220 out of 230. The dancers saved you. They're the ones who brought you back to life that evening in December 1978, who made it possible for you to experience the scalding epiphanic moment of clarity that pushed you through a crack in the universe and allowed you to begin again. Bodies in motion, bodies in space, bodies leaping and twisting through empty, unimpeded air. 8 dancers in a high school gym in Manhattan. 4 men and 4 women, all of them young. 8 dancers in their early 20s. And you sitting in the bleachers with a dozen or so acquaintances of the choreographers to watch an open rehearsal of her new piece. You had been invited by David Reed, a painter you met on the student ship that took you to Europe in 1965. Now your oldest friend in New York, who had asked you to come because he was romantically involved with the choreographer, Nina W., a woman you did not know well, and whose affair with David did not last long. But if you are not distorting the facts, you believe she had started out as a dancer in Merce Cunningham's troupe. Turns out it was Twyla Tharp, by the way. In Merce Cunningham's troupe. And now that she had turned her energies to choreography, her work bore some resemblance to Cunningham's muscular, spontaneous, unpredictable. It was the darkest moment of your life. You were 31 years old. Your first marriage had just cracked apart. You had an 18-month-old son and no regular job, no money to speak of, grinding out your meager, inadequate living as a freelance translator, author of 3 small books of poetry, with at most 100 readers in the world, padding your pittance of an income by writing critical pieces for Harper's, the New York Review of Books, and other magazines. And apart from a pseudonymous detective novel you had written the previous summer in an effort to generate some cash, which still had no publisher, your work had staggered to a halt, You were stuck and confused. You had not written a poem in more than a year, and you were slowly coming to the realization that you would never be able to write again. Such was the spot you were in that winter evening more than 32 years ago, when you walked into the high school gym to watch the open rehearsal of Nina W.'s Work in Progress. You knew nothing about dance, still know nothing about dance, but you have always responded to it with a soaring inner happiness whenever you see it done well. And as you took your seat next to David, you had no idea what to expect, since at that point, Nina W.'s work was unknown to you. She stood on the gym floor and explained to the tiny audience that the rehearsal would be divided into 2 alternating parts: demonstrations of the principal movements of the piece by the dancers and verbal commentary from her. Then she stepped aside, and the dancers began to move around the floor. The first thing that struck you was that there was no musical accompaniment. The possibility had never occurred to you, dancing to silence rather than to music. For music had always seemed essential to dance, inseparable from dance, not only because it sets the rhythm and speed of the performance, but because it establishes an emotional tone for the spectator, giving a narrative coherence to what would otherwise be entirely abstract. But in this case, the dancers' bodies were responsible for establishing the rhythm and tone of the piece. And once you began to settle into it, you found the absence of music wholly invigorating, since the dancers were hearing the music in their heads, the rhythms in their heads, hearing what could not be heard. And because these 8 young people were good dancers, in fact, excellent dancers, it wasn't long before you began to hear those rhythms in your head as well. No sounds then, except the sounds of bare feet thumping against the wooden floor of the gym. You can't remember the details of their movements, but in your mind you see jumping and spinning, falling and sliding, arms waving and arms dropping to the floor, legs kicking out and running forward, bodies touching and then not touching, and you were impressed by the grace and athleticism of the dancers. The mere sight of their bodies in motion seemed to be carrying you to some unexplored place within yourself. And little by little, you felt something lift inside you, felt joy rising through your body and up into your head, a physical joy that was also of the mind, a mounting joy that spread and continued to spread through every part of you. Then, after 6 or 7 minutes, the dancers stopped. Nina W. stepped forward to explain to the audience what they had just witnessed, and the more she talked, the more earnestly and passionately she tried to articulate the movements and patterns of the dance, the less you understood what she was saying. It wasn't because she was using technical terms that were unfamiliar to you. It was the more fundamental fact that her words were utterly useless, inadequate to the task of describing the wordless performance you had just seen. For no words could convey the fullness and brute physicality of what the dancers had done. Then she stepped aside, and the dancers began to move again, immediately filling you with the same joy you had felt before they'd stopped. 5 or 6 minutes later, they stopped again, and once more Nina W. came forward to speak, again failing to capture 100th part of the beauty you had just seen. And back and forth it went for the next hour, the dancers taking turns with the choreographer, bodies in motion followed by words, beauty followed by meaningless noise, joy followed by boredom. And at a certain point, something began to open up inside you. You found yourself falling through the rift between world and word, the chasm that divides human life from our capacity to understand or express the truth of human life. And for reasons that still confound you, this sudden fall through the empty, unbounded air filled you with a sensation of freedom and happiness. And by the time the performance was over, you were no longer blocked, no longer burdened by the doubts that had been weighing down on you for the past year. You returned to your house in Dutchess County, to the downstairs workroom where you had been sleeping since the end of your marriage, and the next day you began to write. For 3 weeks, you worked on a text of no definable genre, neither a poem nor a prose narrative, attempting to describe what you had seen and felt as you'd watched the dancers dance and the choreographer talk in that high school gym in Manhattan, writing many pages to begin with, and then boiling them down to 8 pages. The first work of your second incarnation as a writer. The bridge to everything you have written in the years since then. And you remember finishing during a snowstorm late one Saturday night, 2 o'clock in the morning, the only person awake in the silent house. And the terrible thing about that night, the thing that continues to haunt you, is that just as you were finishing your piece, which you eventually called White Spaces, your father was dying in the arms of his girlfriend. The ghoulish trigonometry of fate. Just as you were coming back to life, your father's life was coming to an end. Then there's a little space, and finally one little last paragraph. In order to do what you do, you need to walk. Walking is what brings the words to you, what allows you to hear the rhythms of the words as you write them in your head. 1 foot forward, and then the other foot forward, the double drumbeat of your heart. 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 feet. This, and then that and then this. Writing begins in the body. It is the music of the body. And even if the words have meaning, can sometimes have meaning, the music of the words is where the meanings begin. You sit at your desk in order to write down the words, but in your head you are still walking, always walking. And what you hear is the rhythm of your heart, the beating of your heart. Mandelstam. I wonder how many pairs of sandals Dante wore out while working on the Commedia. Writing as a lesser form of dance. Okay, thank you. And so now I'm going to read White Spaces, which was written in late December 1978, and I finished it in January. My father died on the 15th, I think, so I must have finished it on the 15th of January of 79. So here it is. Something happens, and from the moment it begins to happen, nothing can ever be the same again. Something happens, or else something does not happen. A body moves, or else it does not move. And if it moves, something begins to happen. And even if it does not move, something begins to happen. It comes from my voice, but that does not mean these words will ever be what happens. It comes and goes. If I happen to be speaking at this moment, it is only because I hope to find a way of going along, of running parallel to everything else that is going along, and so begin to find a way of filling the silence without breaking it. I ask whoever is listening to this voice to forget the words it is speaking. It is important that no one listen too carefully. I want these words to vanish, so to speak, into the silence they came from, and for nothing to remain but a memory of their presence, a token of the fact that they were once here and are here no longer, and that during their brief life they seemed not so much to be saying any particular thing as to be the thing that was happening at the same time a certain body was moving in a certain space, that they moved along with everything else that moved. Something begins, and already it is no longer the beginning, but something else, propelling us into the heart of the thing that is happening. If we were suddenly to stop and ask ourselves, where are we going, or where are we now, we would be lost. For at each moment, we are no longer where we were, but have left ourselves behind irrevocably in a past that has no memory, a past endlessly obliterated by emotion that carries us into the present. It will not do then to ask questions, for this is a landscape of random impulse, of knowledge for its own sake, which is to say, a knowledge that exists, that comes into being beyond any possibility of putting it into words. And if just this once we were to abandon ourselves to the supreme indifference of simply being wherever we happen to be, then perhaps we would not be deluding ourselves into thinking that we too had at last become a part of it all. To think of motion not merely as a function of the body, but as an extension of the mind. In the same way, to think of speech not as an extension of the mind, but as a function of the body. Sounds emerge from the voice to enter the air and surround and bounce off and enter the body that occupies that air. And though they cannot be seen, these words are no less a gesture than a hand is when outstretched in the air towards another hand. And in this gesture can be read the entire alphabet of desire. The body's need to be taken beyond itself, even as it dwells in the sphere of its own motion. On the surface, this motion seems to be random, but such randomness does not in itself preclude a meaning. Or if meaning is not quite the word for it, then say the drift or a consistent sense of what is happening, even as it changes moment by moment. To describe it in all its details is probably not impossible, but so many words would be needed, so many streams of syllables, sentences, and subordinate clauses, that the words would always lag behind what was happening. And long after motion had stopped and each of its witnesses had dispersed, the voice describing that motion would still be speaking, alone, heard by no one, deep into the silence and darkness of these four walls. And yet something is happening, and in spite of myself, I want to be present inside the space of this moment, of these moments, and to say something, even though it will be forgotten, that will form a part of this journey for the length of the time it endures. In the realm of the naked eye, nothing happens that does not have its beginning and its end. And yet nowhere can we find the place or the moment at which we can say, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that this is where it begins, or this is where it ends. For some of us, it has begun before the beginning. And for others of us, it will go on happening after the end. Where to find it? Don't look. Either it is here or it is not here. And whoever tries to find refuge in any one place, in any one moment, will never be where he thinks he is. In other words, say your goodbyes. It is never too late. It is always too late. To say the simplest thing possible, to go no farther than whatever it is I happen to find before me, to begin with this landscape, for example, or even to note the things that are most near, as if in the tiny world before my eyes I might find an image of the life that exists beyond me, as if in a way I do not fully understand, each thing in my life were connected to every other thing, which in turn connected me to the world at large, the endless world that looms up in the mind as lethal and unknowable as desire itself. To put it another way, it is sometimes necessary not to name the thing we are talking about. The invisible God of the Hebrews, for example, had an unpronounceable name. And each of the 99 names tradition ascribes to this God was in fact nothing more than a way of acknowledging that which cannot be spoken, that which cannot be seen, and that which cannot be understood. But even on a less exalted plane, in the realm of the visible itself, we often hold back from divulging the thing we are talking about. Consider the word it. It is raining, we say. Or how is it going? We know what we are saying, and what we mean to say is that it, the word it, stands for something that need not be said, or something that cannot be said. But if the thing we say is something that eludes us, something we do not understand, how can we persist in saying that we understand what we are saying? And yet it goes without saying that we do. The it, for example, in the preceding sentence, it goes without saying, is in fact nothing less than whatever it is that propels us into the act of speech itself. And if it, the word it, is what continually recurs in the effort to define it, then it must be accepted as the given, the precondition of the saying of it. It has been said, for example, that words falsify the thing they attempt to say. But even to say they falsify is to admit that they falsify is true, thus betraying an implicit faith in the power of words to say what they mean to say. And yet, when we speak, we often do not mean to say anything, as in the present case, in which I find these words falling from my mouth and vanishing into the silence they came from. In other words, it says itself, and our mouths are merely the instruments of the saying of it. How does it happen? But never do we ask what it happens to be. We know, even if we cannot put it into words. And the feeling that remains within us, the discretion of a knowledge so fully in tune with the world, has no need of whatever it is that might fall from our mouths. Our hearts know what is in them, even if our mouths remain silent, and the world will know what it is, even when nothing remains in our hearts. A man sets out on a journey to a place he has never been before. Another man comes back. A man comes to a place that has no name, that has no landmarks to tell him where he is. Another man decides to come back. A man writes letters from nowhere, from the white space that is opened up in his mind. The letters are never received. The letters are never sent. Another man sets out on a journey in search of the first man. This second man becomes more and more like the first man until he too is swallowed up by the whiteness. A third man sets out on a journey with no hope of ever getting anywhere. He wanders. He continues to wander. For as long as he remains in the realm of the naked eye, he continues to wander. I remain in the room in which I am writing this. I put one foot in front of the other. I put one word in front of the other. And for each step I take, I add another word, as if for each word to be spoken, there were another space to be crossed, a distance to be filled by my body as it moves through this space. It is a journey through space, even if I get nowhere, even if I end up in the same place I started. It is a journey through space, as if into many cities and out of them, as if across deserts, as if to the edge of some imaginary ocean where each thought drowns in the relentless waves of the real. I put one foot in front of the other, and then I put the other foot in front of the first, which has now become the other, and which will again become the first. I walk within these four walls, and for as long as I am here, I can go anywhere I like. I can go from one end of the room to the other and touch any of the four walls, or even all the walls, one after the other, exactly as I like. If the Spirit moves me, I can stand in the center of the room. If the Spirit moves me in another direction, I can stand in any one of the four corners. Sometimes I touch one of the four corners, and in this way, bring myself into contact with two walls at the same time. Now and then, I let my eyes roam up to the ceiling. And when I am particularly exhausted by my efforts, there is always the floor to welcome my body. The light streaming through the windows never casts the same shadow twice. And at any given moment, I feel myself on the brink of discovering some terrible, unimagined truth. These are moments of great happiness for me. Somewhere, as if unseen and yet closer to us than we realize, down the street, for example, or in the next neighborhood, someone is being born. Somewhere else, a car is speeding along an empty highway in the middle of the night. And that same night, a man is hammering a nail into a board. We know nothing about any of this. A seed stirs invisibly in the earth, and we know nothing about it. Flowers wilt, buildings go up, children cry, and yet, for all that, we know nothing. It happens, and as it continues to happen, we forget where we were when we began. Later, when we have traveled from this moment as far as we have traveled from the beginning, we will forget where we are now. Eventually, we will all go home. And if there are those among us who do not have a home, it is certain, nevertheless, that they will leave this place to go wherever it is they must. If nothing else, life has taught us all this one thing. Whoever is here now will not be here later. I dedicate these words to the things in life I do not understand, to each thing passing away before my eyes. I dedicate these words to the impossibility of finding a word equal to the silence inside me. In the beginning, I wanted to speak of arms and legs, of jumping up and down, of bodies tumbling and spinning, of enormous journeys through space, of cities, of deserts, of mountain ranges stretching farther than the eye can see. Little by little, however, as these words began to impose themselves on me, the things I wanted to do seemed finally to be of no importance. Reluctantly, I abandoned all my witty stories, all my adventures of faraway places, and began, slowly and painfully, to empty my mind. Now, emptiness is all that remains, a space, no matter how small, in which whatever is happening can be allowed to happen. And no matter how small, each and every possibility remains. Even a motion reduced to an apparent absence of motion. A motion, for example, as minimal as breathing itself. The motion the body makes when inhaling and exhaling air. In a book I once read by Peter Freuchen, the famous Arctic explorer describes being trapped by a blizzard in northern Greenland. Alone, his supplies dwindling, he decided to build an igloo and wait out the storm. Many days passed. Afraid, above all, that he would be attacked by wolves, for he heard them prowling hungrily on the roof of his igloo, he would periodically step outside and sing at the top of his lungs in order to frighten them away. But the wind was blowing fiercely, and no matter how hard he sang, the only thing he could hear was the wind. If this was a serious problem, however, the problem of the igloo itself was much greater. For Freuchen began to notice that the walls of his little shelter were gradually closing in on him. Because of the particular weather conditions outside, his breath was literally freezing to the walls. And with each breath, the walls became that much thicker. The igloo became that much smaller, until eventually there was almost no room left for his body. It is surely a frightening thing to imagine breathing yourself into a coffin of ice, and to my mind considerably more compelling than, say, The Pit and the Pendulum by Poe. For, in this case, it is the man himself who is the agent of his own destruction. And further, the instrument of that destruction is the very thing he needs to keep himself alive. For surely a man cannot live if he does not breathe. But at the same time, he will not live if he does breathe. Curiously, I do not remember how Freuchen managed to escape his predicament. But, needless to say, he did escape. The title of the book, if I recall, is Arctic Adventure. It has been out of print for many years. Nothing happens, and still it is not nothing. To invoke things that have never happened is noble, but how much sweeter to remain in the realm of the naked eye. It comes down to this, that everything should count, that everything should be a part of it, even the things I do not or cannot understand. The desire, for example, to destroy everything I have written so far. Not from any revulsion at the inadequacy of these words, although that remains a distinct possibility, but rather from the need to remind myself at each moment that things do not have to happen this way, that there is always another way, neither better nor worse, in which things might take shape. I realize in the end that I am probably powerless to affect the outcome of even the least thing that happens, but nevertheless, and in spite of myself, as if in an act of blind faith, I want to assume full responsibility. And therefore, this desire, this overwhelming need to take these papers and scatter them across the room, or else to go on, or else to begin again, or else to go on, as if each moment were the beginning, as if each word were the beginning of another silence, another word more silent than the last. A few scraps of paper, a last cigarette before turning in, the snow falling endlessly in the winter night. To remain in the realm of the naked eye, as happy as I am at this moment. And if this is too much to ask, then to be granted the memory of it, a way of returning to it in the darkness of the night that will surely engulf me again. never to be anywhere but here, and the immense journey through space that continues, everywhere, as if each place were here, and the snow falling endlessly in the winter night. Thank you.
Siri Hustvedt is the author of 6 novels: The Blindfold, The Enchantment of Lily Doll, What I Loved, The Sorrows of an American, The Summer Without Men, and The Blazing World, published this year. She's also published 3 books of essays: Mysteries of the Rectangle, Essays on Painting, A Plea for Eros, and Living, Thinking, Looking, from 2012. She's published a work of nonfiction, The Shaking Woman, or A History of My Nerves, and a book of poems, Reading to You. She was the recipient of the 2012 International Gabaron Prize for Thought and Humanities. In her short essay, Some Musings on the Word Scandinavia, Siri Hustvedt writes, "The vocabulary and cadences of Norwegian continue to live inside me, and moreover, they haunt my English. My prose is decidedly Protestant, and despite the fact that Scandinavia is no longer exclusively Protestant, its mores and culture were profoundly influenced by that iconoclastic, stark, and lonely version of Christianity." Hustvedt is someone who thinks deeply about language, about its abilities to expose and simultaneously conceal. Her passion for language and her attention to cultural detail are inspiring, especially as she reveals herself in her published writing to be intensely aware of the collage quality of all human experience. The Blazing World, from which Hustvedt will be reading tonight, features a woman, an artist, also intensely aware of this collage quality, so much so that she embarks on the experiment of performing 3 male characters, creating their quite different art practices, and then presenting them to the world. The form of this book as a work of art is also collage-based, as it is a compilation of texts of various authorship within the world created by Hustvedt. In addition to examining the preconceptions gender, among other tags, imposes, Hustvedt is fascinated by a netherworld where roles are not clearly defined, where definitions do not completely hold, a realm where hybridity reigns. An early poem of hers is entitled Hermaphroditic Parallels. This concept reappears in The Blazing World in the expression used to describe the female artist melding with her male persona, quote, "a hermaphroditic self, a mingled reality between the artist and her mask." Transgender concerns recur in a jazz musician born a woman who identifies and performs as a man. And then there is the cross-dressing Margaret Cavendish, described as hermaphroditic polyphony, where, quote, "polyphony is the only route to understanding." This is a form of knowledge entirely fitting to our current moment, expressed in an art form that feels totally contemporary. Tonight, we have the good fortune to be given a tour of this world by its author. Please help me welcome Siri Hustvedt to DIA.
Thank you, Vincent. And yes, you're going to get a little hermaphroditic polyphony. It's just fragments. This is from the editor's introduction. Quote, "All intellectual and artistic endeavors, even jokes, ironies, and parodies, fare better in the mind of the crowd when the crowd knows that somewhere behind the great work or the great spoof, it can locate a cock and a pair of balls," end quote. In 2003, I ran across this provocative sentence in a letter to the editor that was published in an issue of The Open Eye, an interdisciplinary journal I had been reading faithfully for several years. The letter's author, Richard Brickman, did not write the sentence. He was quoting an artist whose name I had never seen in print before, Harriet Burden. Brickman claimed that Burden had written him a long letter about a project she wanted him to make public. Although Burden had exhibited her work in New York City in the 1970s and 80s, she had been disappointed by its reception and had withdrawn from the art world altogether. Sometime in the late 90s, she began an experiment that took her 5 years to complete. According to Brickman, Burden engaged 3 men to act as fronts for her own creative work. 3 solo shows in New York galleries attributed to Anton Tisch, 1998, Phineas Q. Eldridge, 2002, and the artist known only as Rune, 2003, had actually been made by Burden. She titled the project as a whole Maskings and declared that it was meant not only to expose the anti-female bias of the art world, but to uncover the complex workings of human perception and how unconscious ideas about gender, race, and celebrity influence a viewer's understanding of a given work of art. But Brickman went further. He argued that Burden insisted that the pseudonym she adopted change the character of the art she made. In other words, the man she used as a mask played a role in the kind of art she produced. Each artist mask became for Burden a poetized personality, a visual elaboration of a hermaphroditic self, which cannot be said to belong to either her or to the mask, but to a mingled reality created between them. As a professor of aesthetics, I was immediately fascinated by the project for its ambition, but also for its philosophical complexity and sophistication. It goes on, of course, but here we are. Harriet Burden, Notebook C. Harry is musing about becoming someone else, specifically a man. But was I interested in experimenting with my own body, strapping down my boobs and packing my pants? Did I want to live as a man? No. What interested me were perceptions and their mutability, the fact that we mostly see what we expect to see. Didn't the Harry I saw in the mirror change enough as it was? I often wondered if I could truly see myself at all. One day I found myself all right looking and relatively slim, for me that is, and the next day I saw a sagging, bulbous grotesque. How could one account for the change except with the thought that self-image is unreliable at best? No, I wanted to leave my body out of it and take artistic excursions behind other names, and I wanted more than a George Eliot as cover. I wanted my own indirect communications a la Kierkegaard, whose masks clashed and fought, works in which the ironies were thick and thin and nearly invisible. Where would I find a Victor Eremita, an A and a B, a Judge William, a Johannes de Silentio, a Constantine Constantius, a Nicolaus Notabene, a hilarious bookbinder, an a Johannes Climacus, and an anti-Climacus all my own? How such transformations could be achieved in my case was fuzzy at best, no more than mental doodles, but I found them fertile. Hadn't S.K., under his pseudonym, Nota Bene, written a series of prefaces that were followed by no text? What if I invented an artist who was all art criticism, all catalog copy, and no work? How many artists, after all, had been catapulted into importance by drivel written by all those hacks who had taken the linguistic turn? Ah, écriture! The artist would have to be a young man, an enfant terrible, whose emptiness generates page after page after page of text. Oh, the fun of it. I gave it a shot. The aporia in the work of X is achieved through the processes of auto-induction into absence. The implied, hence invisible, autoerotic acts with the sexual origin facilitate an abysmal collapse, the phantasms of rupture and the withdrawal of the object of desire. Dead end. I knew that manufacturing this pretentious, hackneyed prose would kill me. I, Harriet Burden, hereby confess that my diverse fantasies were driven, 1, by a general desire for revenge against twits, dunderheads, and fools, 2, by an ongoing, wrenching intellectual isolation that resulted in loneliness because I roamed in too many books that no one could talk to me about, 3, by a growing sense that I'd always been misunderstood and was madly begging to be seen, truly seen, but nothing I did made any difference. Bruno Kleinfeld, written statement. I met Harry during a dog-eared, smudged, scribbled in the margins, stained and torn chapter of my life. But that was a cosmetic problem, really. I am the proud owner of any number of tattered and beaten biographies that are still decipherable. Time creeps, time alters, gravity insists. As my mother used to say to me, after 50, Bruno, it's just patch, patch, patch. No, it wasn't my going on 60 carcass with receding hairline and basset hound cheeks that made that chapter so bad. It was that I had lost me. I was no longer the hero of my own life. Instead, I was lurking in the proverbial shadows as some goddamned minor character with only a couple of lines of dialogue here and there. Imagine getting up in the morning and scouring the apartment for yourself, turning out drawers and rifling through closets and checking under the bed for yourself. Where had I mislaid him, that bright, curly-headed youth with prospects shining just over yonder hill? Whatever happened to Bruno Kleinfeld, you may well ask. My person seemed to have sidelined itself in ways that meant I was no longer I. The imposter Bruno Kleinfeld, the one who woke up in the morning in the ratty apartment in Red Hook, would have been a big surprise to the actual Bruno Kleinfeld who was traveling boldly from one chapter to another in his fully authorized biography. But I simply couldn't lay my hands on that Bruno and found myself stuck with the former, a sad sack who regularly ate SpaghettiOs for dinner and twice, in desperation, descended to gourmet tidbits for the doggy set. You see, he couldn't pay his rent and had to go panhandling to his old friend Tip Barrymore in Park Slope, whose brownstone life looked far more like the one the genuine Bruno was living. Eyes, it's all in the eyes. Tip's eyes when he said he didn't need it back. I don't need it back, Brune. Brune is the only way to shorten Bruno. Pupils askance, furtive, not straight, double-barreled, not man-to-man. Poor Brune. He didn't say it. Oh, no, his eyes said it. Pity the bright boy of yonder hill. What the fuck, you've got the wrong guy, bub. The wrong Bruno, old man. Take it on the chin, take it in the gut, garçon. Bring me a glass of the Fronsac and the steak frites tout de suite. With mayonnaise, little dreams of meals, little dreams of no roaches, of a smoothly working, rust-free toilet, of linoleum without chips and yellow stains, the sad little dreams of the poseur, that fake Kleinfeld, of swollen proportions and disabled swing with no pop. Who was that guy that used to hit them over the fence, used to speed around the bases, used to be a schmooze artist, ladies' man, seducer, used to be husband to 3 women and father to 3 daughters, promising author of 2 books of poetry published by a major press, major, not minor, verses in minor key, but not of the minor leagues, with tributes from luminaries plastered on back covers with that significant word he had relished, chewed over, sucked on long and hard, Whitmanian. The kid's work is Whitmanian, and there were no less than 3 exclamation marks that ended sentences inside those blurbs by notables of international reputation, emphatic punctuation for emphatically bright boy who raked in grant money on strength of looming hill yonder, young, handsome poet whippersnapper who begins epic poem for the ages, the poem to end all American poems. And he writes, and he writes, and he writes, and then he writes it again, and he cannot get it just the way he wants it. And as he writes it, the years pass. He marries and divorces, and he marries and divorces again, and then again. Children are born, and he is still writing the poem, and he cannot get it the way he wants it. Sometimes he can't see it anymore. He is under the poem, and it is threatening to crush him. He wants the bullshit out of it, don't you see? BK hopes to purify MS of all BS and climb said hill, and he cannot get over it. There are days when he feels he is pushing the poem toward the top, and he can almost see the other side, but then, like Sisyphus, he cannot get it to roll over the summit. And so one morning in October, the false Kleinfeld is gently easing a turd from his aged ass into poorly functioning toilet bowl in aforementioned rat hole with the window shade slightly raised for viewing traffic below and large warehouse building across the street where renovations have been underfoot for quite some time, and he sees her again. The woman he has seen often, nearly every day for many months, and has heard tell about. The tall, striding woman with a pair of tits that make his heart stop. There she is again in another coat, a fern green number with wide sleeves and some kind of built-in scarf that sweeps over her shoulder. Kleinfeld has an idea that the woman has a closet with nothing but coats in it and another for boots, since those change too. She is wrapped up daily, he thinks, in the magic of money, which means simply this: you can tell she isn't thinking about the coat or the boots, they just are. The poor wear their prizes, the gleaming new leather shoes, the just off the rack sweater, the expensive gloves, with a stiff, self-conscious air that gives them away. No, her mind is on greater things, he says to himself. You can tell by the little V between her eyebrows, a philosophical wrinkle, he believes, not a run-of-the-mill V carved in deep by sick worry about rent money and groceries. Hadn't he spied her once, quite by accident? On the remote F train, reading Schelling? God help us, the woman was reading Friedrich von Schelling on the F as calmly as if she were gliding through the daily news. The old Bruno, the speed demon, had looked into Schelling once as an undergraduate and had taken a bad fright, equaled only by his opening up the phenomenology of spirit by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who also scared the boy witless. This was not some regular dame. No, this was a doll with high taste, with ideas dancing in her head like fireflies. The lady's hair was a jumble of curls, and her eyes were big and wide and dark, and she had a long neck and wide square shoulders, and that day, that October morning, as she crossed the street below him, just as she had crossed it many times before, he saw something vulnerable and hurt cross her face that came like a breeze, and as it blew, she suddenly looked very young. Her mouth, her brows, her eyes all contributed to the expression, which didn't last long, but it seemed to Kleinfeld's double sitting there on the pot, boxers around his ankles, that the pain he had seen and she had felt had come and gone with a single grievous thought about someone. That vision kicked him loose. It kicked loose the kid, the bass stealer, the poet of pizzazz, of confidence, and that lost charmer, the original Kleinfeld, returned at least for a moment. And I, for it was I, the Bruno Kleinfeld of old, wiped my ass hastily but thoroughly, grabbed the jeans and shirt lying in a heap before me, whisked my jacket off the hook near the door with its 4 locks, checked the pocket for keys, hurtled down the stairway out the door into the street, and chased the lady like some half-cocked troubadour. I yelled, "Stop!" Okay. The Barometer, excerpt from Phineas Q. Eldridge's tape conversation, October 15th, 2001. The Barometer feels the weather. He has a special gift, and he's been diagnosed with schizophrenia. PQE, how did you get interested in the weather? B, from God. Beginning and end, he is, I proclamate, all weather, the weatherman of all and allness, of all's well that ends well. Windy pressures ride high in his blasted being of beginnings and endings. You understand he is a totalitarian, but also a hotelitarian who takes in mankind, takes him into the inn, but then blows him down. The song goes, blow the man down. Oh, give me some time and give me some rhyme and blow, blow, blow the man down. Blow that puny little butthead man and his kind into ribbons and smithereens. How does he do it? It's a big secret deal of the potentate, the reprobate, the pulverizer and mercifier, the big blue sky daddy who dreams on our screens. That's what happened with the world and trade, the power towers. God had a nightmare, you see, and it went viral onto every TV and computer, and also into the heads of every geek tuned into the net. Divine head, the Godhead storms onto the earth, his curse on our things, but no things we can understand or demand or remand or take in hand. I am blessed with inside scoops of ice cream, and then I scream on these matters, these barometric matters that aren't matter, but air issues for fair weather, which should be fair, but often are not fair in that life is not fair. It all registers, tremors and tickles and rumbles up and down in my organs and my head, in the gray pulp up there with graphs and that little needle wobbling, you know, in there too. My head has a direct connection to the Godhead, 2 heads, and it can be too much, way too much for me, and some days I can't manage the management of the bandages needed, too many, when the earth and the air are crying outside and inside my head. PQE. You've lived with Harry for quite some time now. I've heard you say you want to leave, but you end up staying. B. The reasons are demonish. PQE. Demonish. B. The bad angel who comes sometimes at the dark hour, stealing around in Harry's things, into her world of the metamorphoses and the changelings. The barometer can feel him, his omens. I stay as the barrier. The needle speeds when he's here. I can wrestle. I was on the team. I will wrestle. Jacob wrestled him. The sinew of Jacob's thigh shrank. PQE. Yes, they wrestled all night. I always found it rather homoerotic. But you don't mean Bruno, do you? B. Bruno is not an angel. Have you no eyes? Are you blind and unkind? He comes when you're gone, Phineas. He hides behind the buildings and the trash cans. He keeps his wings folded in, big, awful, veiny wings. He's fallen, you know, fell from heaven to here below, to keep us low, to build our ruin. But nothing broke when he fell. And now he roams through wood and waste, over hill and dale, to the place where longitude meets latitude. You see, don't you, he's fallen down, the arch enemy. If he touches you, you burn and shrivel. Look here on my arm. PQE, You say the angel left that red mark on you? B. A fiery finger of wrathful fate. He said, don't say a word, you crazy fuck, not one word. PQE. He said that? Not very angelic. B. He said that, and then he turned around and walked down the hall, dragging his wings like peacock plumes behind him. One last passage, we're back to Harriet, Notebook M. I am going to build a house woman. She will have an inside and an outside so that we can walk in and out of her. I am drawing and thinking about her form. She must be large, and she must be a difficult woman, but she cannot be a natural horror or a fantasy creature with a vagina dentata. She cannot be a Picasso or a de Kooning monster or Madonna. No either or for this woman. No, she must be true. She must have a head as important as her tail. And there will be characters inside that head, little men and women up to various pursuits. Let them write and sing and play instruments and dance and read very long speeches that put us all to sleep. Let her be my Lady Contemplation, in honor of Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, that 17th century monstrosity, female intellectual. Author of plays, romances, poems, letters, natural philosophy, and a utopian fiction, The Blazing World. I will call my woman The Blazing World after the Duchess. Anti-Cartesian, in the long run anti-atomist, anti-Hobbesian, an exiled royalist in France, but she was a hard-bitten monist and a materialist who couldn't quite leave God out of it. Mad Madge was an embarrassment, a flamboyant boil on the face of nature. She made a spectacle of herself, allowed once as a visitor to the Royal Society to watch experiments in 1666. The Duchess in all her eccentric glory was duly recorded by Samuel Pepys, who recorded everything. He called her a mad, conceited, ridiculous woman. It was easy, still easy. You simply refuse to answer the woman. You don't engage in a dialogue. You let her words or her pictures die. You turn your head away. Centuries pass. The year the first woman was admitted to the Royal Society in 1945. The Duchess sometimes wore men's clothes, vests and cavalier hats. She bowed rather than curtsied. She was a beardless astonishment, a confusion of roles. She staged herself as mask or mask, QUE. Cavalier hat off to you, Duchess. May its plumage wave. Cross-dressers run rampant in Cavendish. How else can a lady gallop into the world? How else can she be heard? She must become a man, or she must leave this world, or she must leave her body, her mean-born body, and blaze. The Duchess is a dreamer. Her characters wield their contradictory words like banners. She cannot decide. Polyphony is the only route to understanding. Hermaphroditic polyphony. What noble mind can suffer a base servitude without rebellious passions? Asked Lady Ward. But the ladies always win in her worlds, through marriage, beauty, argument, and rank wishful fantasy. Lord Courtship is thunderstruck by the woman's lucidity and feeling. He is reborn instantly. Is this not what I want? Look at my work, look and see. How to live, a life in the world or a world in the head, to be seen and recognized outside or to hide and think inside, actor or hermit, which is it? She wanted both, to be inside and outside. to ponder and to leap. She was painfully shy and suffered from melancholia, a drag on her gait. She bragged. She adored her husband. A few sages called her a genius. I am a riot, an opera, a menace. I am Mad Madge, Mad Hatter Harriet, a hideous anomaly who lives at the Heartbreak Hotel near Sunny's Bar on the water in Brooklyn with people straight from the funny papers. Bruno says there are those in the neighborhood who call me the witch. I take it on then. The enchantment of magic and the power of night, which is procreative, fertile, wet. Isn't that where their fear lies? Don't women give birth? Don't we push those squalling babes into the world, suckle them and sing to them? Are we not the makers and shakers of generations? Tiny Gulliver in Brobdingnag looks up at the giant nurse who gives suck to an infant. Quote, "No sight disgusted me so much as her monstrous breast. Its size is alarming and every imperfection of the skin visible," end quote. A Swiftian conflation of microscope and misogyny. But isn't every infant a dwarf at the breast? Mother said, "He ran away from me." I want to blaze and rumble and roar. I want to hide and weep and hold on to my mother. But so do we all. Thank you.